My sister stood up at Thanksgiving dinner, laced her fingers through my husband's hand, and announced she was pregnant. My parents smiled, my father poured champagne, and my mother had prenatal vitamins already waiting in the kitchen. That night, a stranger slid an envelope onto the curb with my name on it, and when I opened the message on my phone, I saw the sonogram stamped with their names. I am Olivia Carter, and what they thought was the beginning of their new life was really the moment I chose to burn it all down. I ring the doorbell of my parents' house in Princeton and practice the smile I promised myself I would wear. The smell of roasted turkey and rosemary presses out through the crack as my mother opens the door. She steps aside with a polite kiss to the air near my cheek and says, "You are right on time." My father calls from the dining room that the gravy is perfect this year. Their voices are warm, but the air is tight. The table is dressed like a magazine spread, silver china, and a centerpiece of dried hydrangeas, place cards in my mother's tidy script. At one end, Sophie sits straight-backed in a silk blouse the color of pale champagne hair, smoothed into soft waves that fall exactly on her shoulders. She is 27 and somehow still the baby. Michael sits beside her. My husband. He keeps his eyes on the water glass, while his knuckles knock a soft rhythm on the stem. We go through the motions. My mother asks about traffic from Manhattan. My father tells a story about a colleague who deep-fried a turkey in the driveway and called the fire department. I nod and chew. Michael does not look at me. When I reach for the rolls, his hand pulls back from the basket as if burned. Then he places it near Sophie's napkin and leaves it there. I watch the movement and feel my pulse quicken with a dread I do not want to name. Halfway through the turkey, my mother reaches for her glass and says, "Let us take a breath and count blessings." She touches Sophie's wrist, a small private signal I almost miss. Sophie sets down her fork. The tap of metal on porcelain sounds like a cymbal in a quiet room. She dabs her lips and leans back with a calm that feels staged. "I have news," she says, the words shaped like something she has rehearsed in a mirror. Her hand slides toward Michael's and waits. He gives it to her. He laces their fingers without glancing my way. "I am pregnant," she says. My fork slips and clatters. Michael does not flinch. He does not say no, or that this is not what you think. He does not say anything. The room narrows until I can only see the seam where their hands lock on the linen. My mother inhales, and then exhales into a smile that looks like relief. She stands and folds Sophie into a careful hug, mindful of jewelry and silk. My father pushes back his chair and rises as if a toast has been requested, then pours a half-inch of champagne into Sophie's glass and another into his own. He does not offer me any. He says this is a blessing and we support the parents-to-be. He says it as if a decision has been made somewhere off-stage and this dinner is only the announcement. I hear my voice thin and strange. Michael says something. He keeps his eyes on the plate. He says we did not plan to tell you like this. His thumb moves in a small circle over Sophie's hand, the movement a promise I am only now noticing. The hum in my ears turns into a roar. I look at my mother, then my father, and search their faces for shock, for anger on my behalf, for anything that remotely resembles defense. My mother pats the back of Sophie's hand and tells her she will need more iron, and that she already has prenatal vitamins from the pharmacy on Nassau Street. My father lifts his glass and says, "Families adapt." Then he looks at me and adds, "Olivia, please do not make a scene." There it is, the old balance tilted all the way. My mind snags on one detail and will not let go. Prenatal vitamins are already in the house. How long have they known? Sophie turns her face toward me with a soft pity that slices. She says it will be better once you accept it. You have always been too sensitive. She says it lightly, like a private joke we share. Michael's hand tightens around hers. I push back my chair. The sound is too loud, but I do not care. My legs feel like borrowed furniture as I stand. I say congratulations. I say it like a person in a borrowed body. My father sets down his glass. His voice is calm. "Sit down, Olivia. We can discuss this like adults after dinner." I hear myself laugh once, a sound without any joy in it. Like adults. in a room where my husband holds my sister's hand, and my parents pass her vitamins across the table. My mother reaches for the gravy boat and asks if Sophie feels any nausea in the mornings. She asks it like she has asked it before. I look at Michael again. He finally raises his eyes to meet mine. There is something like an apology there, and underneath it, something worse. Relief. The cold hits me even before the front door closes. The street is quiet. A few houses away, someone's children are playing tag under a porch light. Jackets, unzipped breath, making small clouds that vanish as soon as they appear. I step off the porch, and the November air slices clean lines through the fog in my head. I make it as far as the sidewalk before I stop. I brace my palms against my thighs and try to breathe without choking on it. A dry leaf skates across the concrete and disappears into the dark. If I look back, I will go back in there and beg for an explanation that will not change what has already been decided in that room. So I keep my eyes on the street and steady my breath. Footsteps sound behind me. I do not have to turn to know they belong to my father. He stops at the edge of the porch and says without crossing the threshold, "Olivia, we will speak in the morning. You will stay in the guest room tonight. It is late. There is no reason to drive." I do not answer. He waits a beat and adds, "We will make this work." The words fall like lids on a box. He goes back inside. The door closes. The lock turns. My phone buzzes in my coat pocket. For a second I consider letting it die there, a small, angry insect I can ignore. Then I pull it out. The screen is full of messages that were sent while I was at the table. A text from my mother sent an hour earlier says, "Do not bring up work tonight, we want a peaceful dinner." A text from Sophie sent 20 minutes before I arrived says, "Be a good sport." Then a photo arrives now from an unknown number with a New Jersey area code. The preview is a gray smear. I tap it open. A sonogram. The date stamped at the top corner is 3 weeks ago. In the center of the image, a grainy crescent floats. At the bottom of the frame, a name has been typed by a clinic printer. Sophie Carter. Below it in smaller letters, the line partner and the name Michael Owen. My hands begin to shake so hard that the phone camera flips by accident and shows my face for a split second, eyes wide, mouth open. I shove the screen dark and pull air into my lungs like I am being held underwater. Headlights swing into the street. A black SUV idles at the end of the drive. The window rolls down. For a heartbeat, I think Michael has followed me, and I brace for his voice. Instead, a woman leans toward the opening. She looks mid-50s, expensive coat hair pulled back with the kind of ease that comes from practice. I do not recognize her. She studies me like she is confirming something, then lifts a hand in a small signal that asks for patience. She says my name softly. "Olivia. You do not know me. I represent the Vance Family Clinic in Trenton." My breath fogs between us. She continues before I find words. "I think you should see something before you go back in there." She lifts a flat envelope from the passenger seat, the kind used for legal papers, and taps it once with 2 fingers. Then she sets it on the curb beside the mailbox, as if it were a fragile animal she is afraid to scare. She looks past me toward the warm rectangle of my parents' dining room window. She says I will come back tomorrow if you want to talk. The SUV pulls away without waiting for an answer. The envelope sits under the mailbox like a small, pale door I have to choose to open. Behind me, the house glows. Inside that glow, my mother will be filling plates, my father will be talking about schedules, and Sophie will be pressing the back of Michael's hand to her flat stomach to teach the room a new shape for the word family. I stand in the dark with the envelope and the sonogram, and a chill sinking slowly into my bones. There is a version of this night where I go back inside and follow the rules. There is another where I step off the sidewalk, pick up the envelope, and let a stranger pull a thread that unravels all of it. A car door slams somewhere down the block. The sound snaps me forward. I reach for the envelope, fingers numb, and slide it into my coat pocket. My phone buzzes again. A new message appears from the same unknown number. It says 2 words and a date. Check the back. Tomorrow morning. I close my hand around the paper until it crinkles and start walking toward the driveway, not toward the front door, but toward my car at the curb. The porch light washes over my shoulder blades and then falls away. The night opens wider in front of me. I gripped the steering wheel and forced myself to breathe. The cold air seeped through the seams of my coat, but my chest still burned with the heat of betrayal. The house behind me glowed with warmth and laughter, and yet I had never felt more cut off. I did not make it far. My feet carried me back across the gravel before I realized what I was doing. I needed answers. I needed Michael to look at me and explain why the man I had trusted more than anyone now sat hand in hand with my sister. The kitchen lights were still on when I slipped in through the side door. My parents' voices drifted from the living room low and measured, as though discussing the stock market rather than the wreckage of their eldest daughter's life. Sophie's laughter floated above it, sweet and victorious. Michael stood by the counter, glass of water in his hand, his shoulders rigid. I shut the door quietly, and the click made him turn. His eyes widened, guilt flashing across his face before he could arrange it into indifference. "Why?" My voice broke, but I forced the word out. "Tell me why, Michael." He set the glass down carefully like a man defusing a bomb. "Olivia not here. Please." "Here," I said, stepping closer. "In this house, at this table, you let her announce it. You didn't even deny it." He looked down at the counter, jaw tightening. Silence filled the space between us, heavy and deliberate. The door swung open, and Sophie appeared, a picture of ease with her hand on the frame. She tilted her head, eyes bright with cruelty. "He doesn't have to explain," she said. "At least I can give him something you never could." The words hit harder than any slap. I felt my throat close, my breath falter. "You think this makes you better?" I whispered. Sophie stepped further in her perfume, cloying in the air. "It makes me chosen." He wanted more than endless disappointment, and I gave it to him. A family, a future. Something you were never enough for. Michael flinched but said nothing. His silence was worse than her venom. I braced myself against the counter to steady the trembling in my hands. "And you?" I turned to him, voice low but shaking with fury. "Is this true? That I was never enough?" He opened his mouth, closed it again. No denial, no fight. Only silence. Behind us, the muffled clink of glasses, and my father's laugh floated in from the living room. Not one word of defense, not one note of outrage from the people who should have stood by me. It was then I understood. I was alone in this house, cut out as neatly as if they had taken scissors to the family portrait and left a jagged hole where I used to be. Sophie leaned closer, her smile sharp. "You should leave, Olivia, before you embarrass yourself further." I pushed past her, the brush of her shoulder against mine like fire on raw skin. The hallway stretched before me, and the sound of my parents' voices swelled as I passed the living room. My mother glanced up, cool and detached, then returned to adjusting the cranberry centerpiece. My father did not even turn his head. The realization hollowed me. They had chosen their side long before tonight. I reached the front hall, my pulse thundering in my ears, and pulled on my coat with stiff fingers. For a moment I thought I might collapse right there on the marble tile. But then a sound broke through the faint rustle of the envelope still tucked in my pocket. The envelope from the stranger. I closed my hand around it, feeling the edge press into my palm. Whatever it contained was now my only tether, the only thing left that was mine. The porch light still burned as I opened the door. The night air was sharp, slicing through the fog inside me. I stepped out once more, the voices of my family fading behind me, and this time I did not look back. The envelope crinkled as I tightened my grip. Tomorrow, I would find out what secrets it carried. Tonight, all I had was the silence of the street and the sound of my own footsteps, steady and deliberate as I walked into the darkness. The cab ride back into Manhattan felt endless. The driver kept the radio low, some old jazz tune murmuring against the hum of traffic, but I barely heard it. Streetlights flashed across the window in fractured intervals, throwing my reflection back at me. I hardly recognized the face that stared back. My lips pressed tight, my eyes hollow. I clutched my coat around me as though fabric alone could shield me from the hollow ache spreading through my chest. When the car finally stopped in front of my building, I slid a few bills into the driver's hand and climbed out without waiting for change. The doorman greeted me with his usual polite nod, but even he seemed to notice something in the way I moved. I pressed the elevator button with a hand that trembled despite my attempt to still it. The ride to the 12th floor was quiet, the soft ding at each passing floor marking the seconds I dreaded stepping into my apartment. When the doors opened, I forced myself to walk down the carpeted hall, key in hand. The lock clicked, and the door swung open to reveal the space I had once thought of as a sanctuary. Tonight, it looked like a museum of lies. The first thing I saw was the photograph on the console table. Michael's arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling against the backdrop of Central Park in spring. My fingers hovered above the frame, then pulled back as if the glass might burn. I slipped off my heels and walked deeper inside. The apartment was everything a real estate agent would boast about. Hardwood floors polished to a sheen, floor-to-ceiling windows, framing the skyline, a kitchen, outfitted with marble counters and stainless steel appliances. But all I saw were the ghosts hidden in each corner. On the sofa lay the throw blanket we picked out together at Bloomingdale's. In the kitchen sat the mugs we bought in pairs, his with a navy stripe, mine with green. The closet still held the dress I wore when we signed the marriage papers at City Hall, the faint scent of lavender clinging to its fabric even after years. I sank into a chair at the dining table and let my eyes roam the room, each object pressing memories against me, until I could hardly breathe. My gaze landed on the wedding photo above the bar cart. Michael in his tailored suit, me in lace, both of us laughing like the future would always be ours. The frame tilted slightly, and for a fleeting moment I wanted to smash it to see shards scatter and release me from the weight it carried. Instead, I closed my eyes. In the silence, fragments of that day flickered. The rush to the courthouse, the sharp scent of roses someone had left in a vase, the weight of his hand over mine as we signed. But it was distant now, dimmed like a dream I could barely touch. The happiness that once felt permanent had receded into something untouchable, replaced by the hollow sting of betrayal. I stood and drifted toward the bedroom. The bed was made sheets tucked with a neatness that felt foreign. On his nightstand lay the book he had been reading, a bookmark sticking out halfway. I reached for it, then froze my hand hovering above the spine before I let it fall. I could not bring myself to disturb even that. The city outside buzzed with its usual chorus of sirens, horns, and voices, but up here it was muted. The silence pressed in until the loneliness felt unbearable. I walked back to the living room and poured a glass of water, though my throat was too tight to swallow. My phone buzzed with a notification, but I turned it face down without looking. I already knew no message could ease the heaviness. Hours seemed to stretch without meaning. I drifted from room to room like an intruder, touching surfaces that once felt familiar, now foreign. I opened the closet and traced my hand along the sleeves of dresses lined up neatly, each one tied to a memory I wished I could cut away. A navy gown from the charity gala where Michael whispered promises in my ear, a white blouse from the weekend trip to the Hamptons, a red dress I wore on our anniversary when he told me he loved me more than anything. Lies sewn into fabric. I sat at the vanity and caught sight of myself in the mirror. My face was pale, streaked from tears I hadn't realized had fallen. I leaned closer, searching for the woman I thought I was. The wife, the partner, the daughter who belonged. She was gone, replaced by someone staring into the hollow of her own life. The clock ticked past midnight, but sleep felt impossible. The apartment pulsed with memories too loud to let me rest. I lay on the bed anyway, staring at the ceiling, the edges of the city lights leaking through the blinds. I thought about walking out again, leaving everything behind, but I had nowhere to go. This was my home, even if it now felt like a prison. My hand brushed against the inside of my coat, where the envelope still rested. Its weight pressed against me like a secret waiting to be unwrapped. I had avoided opening it, afraid of what truths it might contain. But as the night stretched thinner and the silence grew heavier, I clutched it in my hand, the edges cutting into my skin. I placed it on the nightstand, unopened the pale paper, stark against the dark wood. The promise of whatever it held lingered there beside me, silent but insistent. My eyes closed only when exhaustion finally won, pulling me into restless half-dreams. The envelope remained within reach, waiting for morning. The morning light cut across the blinds too sharp for the little sleep I had managed. My head pounded heavy from the weight of everything I tried not to think about. I reached for the envelope on the nightstand, holding it in my hands for a moment, but I did not open it. Not yet. I had a job to get to, and even in ruins routine pulled me forward. The subway ride into Midtown felt different. People leaned into their phones, whispers carried across the car, and I caught the edge of my own name in a conversation 2 seats away. I told myself it was my imagination until I walked through the glass doors of the advertising firm and saw heads turn. At my desk, coworkers dropped their voices when I passed. A friend from the copy team gave me a look that was half pity, half fear, then turned back to her screen without a word. I sat, forcing my breathing even, and opened my laptop. A news alert popped up on the browser before I could log in. "Carter family holiday implodes," read the headline. My stomach lurched. The article recounted Sophie's announcement at Thanksgiving, the revelation of my husband's betrayal, my exit from the house. The details were too sharp, too close. Someone in that dining room had talked. I slammed the window closed, but the damage was done. A ping sounded from my inbox. "Meeting request, David Harris, 10 o'clock. My stomach sank. When the time came, I walked the corridor to his office, as if headed to a sentencing. David sat behind his sleek desk, hands folded, expression grim. He gestured for me to sit. "Olivia," he began, his tone measured. "I need you to understand this isn't personal. Our largest client has pulled their contract. They don't want to be associated with this kind of publicity." I swallowed hard. "It's my family's scandal, not the company's." He sighed, leaning back. "The optics don't care about fairness. The press has linked your name to every headline. They don't see boundaries. They see risk." The words slid over me like cold water. My voice cracked. "So I am punished for what they did." David's eyes softened, but his words did not. "We were reviewing candidates for the creative director role this quarter." "I'm sorry, Olivia. That consideration is off the table now." My throat closed. I pressed my palms into my knees to keep from shaking. "I have given years to this company. I built half the campaigns in our portfolio." "I know," he said quietly. "And I value you. But I have to protect the firm." Silence stretched between us. My pulse thundered in my ears. Finally, I stood my chair, scraping against the floor. I nodded once, stiff, and walked out before my voice could betray me further. Back at my desk, the whispers were louder. A junior designer asked someone if I was the one whose husband had gotten my sister pregnant. The words spread like smoke through the office. I stared at my screen, but the letters blurred, unreadable. By lunch, I could not take another glance, another murmur. I left the office without eating, the November air biting at my face as I walked up Park Avenue. The city buzzed with its usual rhythm, but I moved through it like a shadow. I found myself at Bryant Park, sitting on a cold bench, watching skaters loop around the rink. Their laughter carried in the air, sharp and bright against my silence. My phone buzzed again. A message from a colleague, short and sharp. "Sorry about what's happening. People talk too much." I wanted to throw the phone into the ice. Instead, I turned it off and slid it into my pocket. The day dragged until I forced myself back to the office. I gathered my things, ignoring the way eyes followed me. I walked out without a word. Back at the apartment, the city lights stretched across the windows like they always had, but tonight they looked like bars on glass. I dropped my bag and stood in the center of the living room, the silence pressing hard. The walls still carried our wedding photo. The mug still sat neatly in the kitchen, and the envelope waited on the nightstand. I sat on the couch, pressing my palms to my face. Everything had slipped at once. Marriage, family, now career. It felt like falling through layers with no bottom in sight. In the quiet, I heard the faint hum of the refrigerator. The distant siren blocks away the sound of my own breath. I looked at the unopened envelope across the room. The one thing untouched by the noise outside, by the whispers, by the loss. I stood slowly, walking toward it, my hand hovering just above the flap. My heart pounded with a mixture of dread and fragile hope. The knock at the door made me freeze. The sound was sharp, urgent, cutting through the silence of the apartment. I turned toward it, my hand still on the envelope. The knock came again, sharper this time, echoing across the apartment. I set the envelope down and walked to the door, my hand hovering over the handle. When I opened it, a woman stood in the hallway wrapped in a dark wool coat, her expression steady but unreadable. She introduced herself quietly, a name I only half caught, then handed me a card. Divorce attorney, Midtown East. She said she had been referred that people in my position often waited too long. Before I could answer, she pressed the card into my palm, told me to call in the morning, and disappeared down the hall. I closed the door and stared at the simple rectangle of cardstock. The letters were crisp, the phone number printed in bold. For the first time since the holiday table erupted, I felt the faint trace of a path forward. Morning came heavy, my eyes raw from too little rest. The card still lay on the counter where I had dropped it. My hand shook as I dialed the number. A receptionist's calm voice answered, then transferred me. Minutes later, another voice came on the line, confident and direct. Rachel Miller. She offered to meet that afternoon. I left the apartment early, unable to stand another hour surrounded by remnants of a marriage that felt like a costume I could no longer wear. The law office sat on the 20th floor of a sleek glass building near Grand Central. The waiting room smelled faintly of leather and fresh paper. When Rachel emerged, she was taller than I expected, with sharp eyes that carried both intelligence and an odd kind of reassurance. She led me into her office, where shelves lined with casebooks stretched to the ceiling. I sat, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Rachel folded her arms and studied me for a moment. "Tell me everything," she said. The words spilled out before I could stop them. Sophie's announcement. Michael's silence, my parents' indifference, the article, the whispers at work, the lost promotion. By the time I finished, my throat ached and my palms were damp. Rachel nodded slowly, pulling a folder from her desk. "I assume you and your husband signed a prenuptial agreement when you married." "Yes," I whispered. "City Hall 3 years ago." She flipped through a copy, her voice measured as she read aloud key clauses. "Olivia Carter retains primary residence in the event of dissolution. That means the apartment stays with you." She glanced up, waiting for me to absorb it. I blinked, stunned. "This place? The condo in Manhattan?" "Yes." She pointed to the paragraph again. "It is explicitly stated. You also retain joint savings currently listed as $250,000 at the time of signing. That account is yours." My chest tightened, disbelief and fragile relief warring inside me. "And Michael," she continued, "has agreed to pay 20% of his annual income as child support in the event of separation involving dependents. His average income was around $250,000 a year when you married?" "Correct." I nodded faintly. "That would mean about $50,000 annually." Rachel closed the folder. "These terms are enforceable. Michael may have thought he was clever by weaving himself into your family, but legally, you hold the stronger hand." For the first time in weeks, something inside me steadied. The betrayal still cut deep, but the law was different. The law had no bias, no mother's silence, no father's shrug. "What do I do next?" I asked. Rachel leaned forward. "We begin proceedings immediately. You file for divorce citing infidelity. The scandal may sting socially, but in this office it is evidence. We will secure your residence, your savings, and child support if necessary. And if he resists, we press harder." Her voice was steel, but behind it was the faintest trace of empathy. I swallowed hard, my fingers curling against the arms of the chair. Walking back to the subway, the city looked the same as it always did. Horns blaring, pedestrians, rushing steam rising from grates. But something had shifted in me. The ground beneath my feet no longer felt like quicksand. It felt solid, edged with the sharp lines of paper and ink signatures and clauses. That evening, I sat at my dining table, the prenup copy Rachel had given me spread out before me. The lines of text blurred, but the message was clear. For all the ways Michael and Sophie had twisted my life, they had not taken everything. The apartment was mine, the savings were mine, and the law had carved a way forward. The envelope from the stranger still sat unopened beside me, its weight a separate mystery. I looked from the crisp legal pages to the pale paper waiting in silence. Both promised revelations, but one had already shown me something I had forgotten I could have: power. I touched the envelope lightly, then drew my hand back. Not tonight. Tonight I needed the certainty of legal ink more than the risk of secrets. I gathered the papers and placed them neatly in a folder, sliding it into the drawer of my desk. My hands were steadier now, my breathing deeper. The apartment still echoed with the ghosts of Michael's laughter and Sophie's cruelty, but the walls no longer felt like a cage. Outside, the city pulsed with its endless rhythm. Inside, I sat in silence, the legal contract anchoring me, and let the smallest seed of resolve take root. The following Sunday, I drove back to Princeton, the silence inside my car as heavy as the gray clouds rolling across the sky. My parents had asked me to come over, their voices clipped on the phone as if arranging a business meeting rather than inviting their daughter home. I almost turned around twice on the highway, but something in me needed to hear what they would say to my face. The house looked the same, the red brick clean, the shutters freshly painted, the yard tidy. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Then I forced myself out and walked to the door. My mother opened it, her pearl necklace resting exactly in place as always. She kissed the air near my cheek, her expression unreadable. In the living room, my father stood near the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back. He looked up at me with the same detached eyes he used when giving financial advice. "Olivia, thank you for coming," he said. "Sit down." Sit. I lowered myself onto the edge of the sofa. My mother perched in the chair opposite me, legs crossed neatly, her manicured nails tapping against the armrest. My father cleared his throat. "We know things have been difficult," he began. "But we must all think about what comes next." "What comes next?" I repeated, my voice brittle. "What comes next is I file for divorce and I move on with my life." My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "That is precisely why we wanted to speak with you. Sophie is expecting. She will need stability, a home." My heart stopped. I waited, certain I had misheard. But my father continued calmly, as if reading from a prepared script. "It would be best for everyone if you considered allowing Sophie and Michael to have the apartment." The words struck like a physical blow. I gripped the sofa cushion, nails digging into fabric. "That apartment is mine. It is in the prenup. It has nothing to do with Sophie." My mother's gaze hardened. "You have your career, your independence. Sophie will have a child. Do you truly want your nephew or niece brought into the world without a secure place to live?" I laughed once, sharp and bitter. "You would take my home, my marriage, my dignity, and hand it to them as if I never existed." My father's voice rose slightly, not with anger, but with authority. "This is about the baby, Olivia. Families make sacrifices. Sacrifices." I whispered the words sour in my mouth. "Always mine, never hers." Before either of them could answer, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Sophie appeared, her silk blouse hugging the curve of her stomach, though it was still flat. Michael followed behind, his hand resting at the small of her back. She leaned into him, eyes glinting with triumph. Sophie tilted her head. "We just want what is best for the child. Surely you can understand that, sister." My throat burned, but my voice came out steady. "You stood in our parents' dining room and destroyed me in front of everyone. You took my husband, and now you expect me to hand you my home." Michael's eyes flickered, but he said nothing. Sophie's smile widened, her hand sliding over his. "It is not about expectations, Olivia. It is about reality. You cannot hold on to everything." My chest heaved with fury. I turned back to my parents, searching their faces for some flicker of shame, but found only cold resolve. I realized then that they were not asking. They were delivering a verdict. I stood, my body trembling. "You have made your choice. You chose them, you chose betrayal, and now you ask me to erase myself entirely." My mother's voice softened with practiced patience. "Please, Olivia, be reasonable." "Reasonable," I repeated, my voice cracking. "No, I will not be reasonable. I will fight. I will use every law, every contract, every truth you try to bury." Sophie's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, but she quickly recovered, resting her head against Michael's shoulder. My father sighed, as if I were a stubborn child refusing a chore. I stepped toward the door, my pulse hammering. I paused once in the hallway, turning back just enough to see their faces framed in the glow of the chandelier. My mother's pearls, my father's frown, Sophie's triumphant stare, Michael's silence. The family I once believed in, reduced to strangers, united against me. "I will never give you what you want," I said quietly. "Not the apartment, not my silence, not my surrender." Then I opened the door and walked into the cold air, the sound of it slamming behind me like a final sentence. The night pressed against me heavy and sharp, but somewhere deep in the hollow of my chest burned the fire of a vow. I would not be erased. The following Sunday I drove back to Princeton, the silence inside my car as heavy as the gray clouds rolling across the sky. My parents had asked me to come over, their voices clipped on the phone, as if arranging a business meeting rather than inviting their daughter home. I almost turned around twice on the highway, but something in me needed to hear what they would say to my face. The house looked the same, the red brick clean, the shutters freshly painted, the yard tidy. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Then I forced myself out and walked to the door. My mother opened it, her pearl necklace resting exactly in place as always. She kissed the air near my cheek, her expression unreadable. In the living room, my father stood near the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back. He looked up at me with the same detached eyes he used when giving financial advice. "Olivia, thank you for coming," he said. "Sit down." I lowered myself onto the edge of the sofa. My mother perched in the chair opposite me, legs crossed neatly, her manicured nails tapping against the armrest. My father cleared his throat. "We know things have been difficult," he began. "But we must all think about what comes next." "What comes next?" I repeated, my voice brittle. "What comes next is, I file for divorce, and I move on with my life." My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "That is precisely why we wanted to speak with you. Sophie is expecting. She will need stability, a home." My heart stopped. I waited, certain I had misheard. But my father continued calmly, as if reading from a prepared script. "It would be best for everyone if you considered allowing Sophie and Michael to have the apartment." The words struck like a physical blow. I gripped the sofa cushion, nails digging into fabric. "That apartment is mine. It is in the prenup. It has nothing to do with Sophie." My mother's gaze hardened. "You have your career, your independence. Sophie will have a child. Do you truly want your nephew or niece brought into the world without a secure place to live?" I laughed once, sharp and bitter. "You would take my home, my marriage, my dignity, and hand it to them as if I never existed." My father's voice rose slightly, not with anger, but with authority. "This is about the baby, Olivia. Families make sacrifices." "Sacrifices." I whispered, the words sour in my mouth. "Always mine, never hers." Before either of them could answer, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Sophie appeared, her silk blouse hugging the curve of her stomach, though it was still flat. Michael followed behind, his hand resting at the small of her back. She leaned into him, eyes glinting with triumph. Sophie tilted her head. "We just want what is best for the child. Surely you can understand that, sister." My throat burned, but my voice came out steady. "You stood in our parents' dining room and destroyed me in front of everyone. You took my husband, and now you expect me to hand you my home." Michael's eyes flickered, but he said nothing. Sophie's smile widened, her hand sliding over his. "It is not about expectations, Olivia. It is about reality. You cannot hold on to everything." My chest heaved with fury. I turned back to my parents, searching their faces for some flicker of shame, but found only cold resolve. I realized then that they were not asking. They were delivering a verdict. I stood, my body trembling. "You have made your choice. You chose them, you chose betrayal, and now you ask me to erase myself entirely." My mother's voice softened with practiced patience. "Please, Olivia." Be reasonable. Reasonable. I repeated, my voice cracking. No, I will not be reasonable. I will fight. I will use every law, every contract, every truth you try to bury. Sophie's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, but she quickly recovered, resting her head against Michael's shoulder. My father sighed as if I were a stubborn child refusing a chore. I stepped toward the door, my pulse hammering. I paused once in the hallway, turning back just enough to see their faces framed in the glow of the chandelier. My mother's pearls, my father's frown, Sophie's triumphant stare, Michael's silence. The family I once believed in reduced to strangers, united against me. I will never give you what you want, I said quietly. Not the apartment, not my silence, not my surrender. Then I opened the door and walked into the cold air, the sound of it slamming behind me like a final sentence. The night pressed against me, heavy and sharp, but somewhere deep in the hollow of my chest burned the fire of a vow. I would not be erased. I returned to Manhattan with a weight in my chest that no amount of deep breaths could dissolve. Days blurred into each other. I worked in silence, avoided phone calls, and let meals sit untouched on the counter until I threw them away. My apartment felt like a battlefield of memories, each corner reminding me of something I had lost. It was Anna who refused to let me vanish inside that silence. She showed up one Saturday morning, knocking until I opened the door, her gym bag slung over her shoulder. Her eyes studied me, catching the shadows under mine, the way my shoulders hunched. Without asking, she said, "We are going to yoga." I almost argued, but the exhaustion in me was too deep for resistance. I let her tug me into her car and drive to a small studio tucked above a coffee shop in Soho. The room smelled faintly of incense and lavender. The instructor, a woman with calm eyes and braided hair, dimmed the lights and told us to close our eyes to breathe. At first I couldn't follow. My breaths came shallow, jagged, as if my lungs refused to expand. The poses felt foreign, my body stiff, my balance uncertain. Around me, people moved with grace while I stumbled. Frustration rose in my chest, hot and sharp. Anna whispered, "Just focus on the breathing. Forget the poses." Her voice anchored me for a moment, but halfway through the class, my body gave out. My vision blurred. The mat shifted under me, and then everything tilted into darkness. When I opened my eyes, the ceiling was white, and humming lights flickered above me. I turned my head and realized I was in a hospital bed. A monitor beeped softly beside me, the rhythm steady and impersonal. Then I saw her. Anna sat slouched in the chair, her head resting against her hand, eyes closed but still alert in her posture, as if ready to move the moment I stirred. "Olivia," she said when she noticed me awake, her voice breaking with relief. "You fainted. Dehydration, stress, exhaustion. The doctor said you need to slow down." Tears pressed against my eyes, not from weakness, but from the sight of her sitting there refusing to leave me. My family had cast me out. My husband had betrayed me. My career had faltered. But this one person chose to stay, to guard me when I had nothing to give in return. I whispered, "Thank you." She reached for my hand and squeezed it. "You're not alone, Liv. No matter what they do, you still have people who care." That night, I lay awake in the hospital bed, listening to the quiet shuffle of nurses in the hallway. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel completely hollow. The image of Anna sitting in that chair stayed with me like a lantern in the dark. When they released me the next morning, she drove me home. On the ride, she handed me a small leather notebook. "Start writing," she said. "Get it out of your head and onto the page. Trust me, it helps." I carried the notebook upstairs and placed it on the table. That evening I opened it and stared at the blank page for a long time. My hand trembled when I picked up the pen, but words began to form. Not polished, not careful, just raw. Anger, betrayal, loneliness. Then more. Fragments of memories, questions without answers, sentences I had swallowed for years. By the time I stopped, the first 5 pages were filled, and the tightness in my chest had eased just slightly. In the mornings, I practiced breathing exercises I remembered from the yoga class. In through the nose, hold out through the mouth. At first, it felt artificial, but slowly my pulse learned to follow the rhythm. The notebook became a place where I could bleed without judgment, and each entry left me a little lighter. Anna kept pulling me to classes, sometimes yoga, sometimes therapy groups, where people shared stories of betrayal, loss, and survival. At first, I sat in silence listening to strangers talk about divorces, illnesses, broken families. But eventually I heard myself speaking too, my voice unsteady but real. Each time I admitted the truth out loud, it loosened the grip of shame that had held me. Weeks passed. The bruises in my mind did not vanish, but they softened. I learned to cook small meals again, to take walks at night without drowning in thoughts. The city's streets no longer looked like cages, but like paths I could still walk. One night, I sat on the floor of my living room, the notebook open on my lap. I wrote about the vow I had made in my parents' house, the vow not to be erased. But I added something new. I would not just survive. I would rebuild. Piece by piece, breath by breath. The window was cracked open, and the winter air slipped in cool and sharp. I breathed deeply, steady now, and let the silence settle around me. For the first time, it did not feel like an enemy. It felt like space. Somewhere inside that space, I began to feel the outline of strength, returning, not the brittle kind that breaks under weight, but the quiet kind that bends and holds. The courthouse in Newark loomed tall and gray against the winter sky, its stone steps dusted with salt from the morning snow. I climbed them slowly, each breath steady. Rachel's voice a quiet anchor beside me. She carried a slim leather folder, the prenuptial agreement tucked inside, like a blade ready to be drawn. Inside the courtroom, smelled faintly of polish and old paper. I sat at the table with Rachel, my palms pressed against the cool surface to ground myself. Across the aisle, Michael adjusted his tie with shaking hands. His lawyer leaned close, whispering strategy. Behind him, Sophie sat in the gallery, her coat unbuttoned just enough to reveal the curve of her stomach. She folded her hands over it, her gaze locked on me with a mixture of triumph and challenge. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge, a woman with silver hair pulled into a bun, took her seat. She looked down at us with eyes that carried neither pity nor warmth, only the weight of law. Michael's lawyer began first, his tone smooth, rehearsed. He spoke of fairness, of providing stability for the unborn child, of how Sophie needed a safe home. He painted me as selfish, clinging to property rather than family. My chest burned, but I stayed silent. Rachel touched my arm lightly, reminding me to hold. When it was our turn, Rachel rose, unfolding the document with deliberate care. She spoke with precision, her voice sharp enough to slice through every false plea. The prenuptial agreement signed at City Hall 3 years ago, witnessed, notarized, and valid under New Jersey law. She read the clauses aloud, each one falling like a hammer. Olivia Carter retains primary residence. Olivia Carter retains joint savings of $250,000. Michael Owen agrees to provide 20% of his annual income in the event of child support proceedings. The courtroom grew still. Michael shifted, his face tightening. Sophie's smirk faltered, her hands tightening on her lap. The judge studied the papers, her brow furrowed as she flipped through each page. Then she looked directly at Michael. "Did you sign this?" His voice cracked. "Yes, Your Honor." "And you understood its terms?" "Yes." "Then the ruling is clear," she said. "The apartment remains with Mrs. Carter. The savings remain with her as well. Mr. Owen, you will provide 20% of your annual income as ordered to be allocated for child support." The words landed with finality. For a moment I could not move. Sophie let out a choked sob, her face contorting as tears streaked down her cheeks. Michael lowered his head, his shoulders collapsing inward as if the fight had drained from him all at once. Rachel gathered the documents calmly, sliding them back into her folder. She glanced at me, a small nod, quiet but victorious. I rose slowly, my chair scraping softly against the floor. My legs felt strong, my spine straight. I walked past Michael without a word, past Sophie's tear-streaked face, past the empty stares of people who once believed they could erase me. Outside, the cold air rushed against my skin, sharp and bracing. The courthouse doors closed behind me, heavy and final. I stood at the top of the steps, lifting my chin against the winter wind. For the first time since it all began, I felt the weight shift off my shoulders. Justice, unflinching and unsentimental, had chosen my side. I returned to Manhattan carrying the weight of the verdict like a shield across my chest. The city lights flickered against the glass as I stepped into my apartment, but for the first time the walls did not feel like they were closing in. They were mine legally and irrevocably. Yet everywhere I looked, I still saw him, still heard his voice. The law had cut ties on paper, but the memories lingered like stains that refused to fade. That night, I opened the closet where a box of photographs sat on the top shelf. Wedding photos, framed prints, smiling faces in white and black bound albums filled with promises that had curdled into lies. I carried them to the balcony, the cold wind stinging my cheeks. I set them in a metal tray, struck a match, and watched the fire consume each glossy image. Our smiles curled inward, our eyes melted into ash, and the scent of burning paper rose sharp into the night. The flames licked high, reflected in the glass towers around me. I stood until nothing remained but black flakes drifting into the wind. The following morning I took the ring. It had sat in a velvet box for weeks untouched, but never ignored. My fingers trembled as I slipped it into my coat pocket and walked toward the Hudson. The river was iron gray under the winter sky waves lapping against the stone edge. I stood at the railing, the cold metal biting into my palms. The diamond glinted once in the faint sun as I held it between my fingers. My hand shook, memories flooding in. The day he placed it on my finger, the promises whispered, the laughter of family surrounding us. For a brief moment, I almost closed my hand around it again, but then I forced my grip to loosen. The ring dropped, catching the light one final time before sinking into the dark water below. I exhaled sharply, as if the river had pulled the last breath of him from me. I walked away, my hands still tingling from the release, but my eyes steady fixed ahead. It was the last chain severed. Later that week, I went to the courthouse again, not to fight, but to reclaim. I signed the documents to restore my maiden name. The clerk read the form aloud, and I answered firmly, my voice echoing in the quiet office. Olivia Carter. My name before Michael, before betrayal, before the family that had turned me into an afterthought. When the papers were stamped, a strange calm spread through me, as if the ground beneath my feet had shifted back into place. That night, I returned home and looked at the doorbell where his last name still lingered on the small brass plate. I peeled it off with my nails, the thin strip bending until it snapped. I tossed it into the trash and pressed the new name into place. My own name, my own life. The apartment was silent when I stepped inside. The photographs were gone, the ring was gone, the name was mine again. For the first time in months, the silence felt clean rather than suffocating. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, the counters, the windows, as though claiming them anew. When I finally sat on the sofa, the city stretched out beneath me. I could still feel the tremor in my hand where the ring had fallen, still smell the faint trace of smoke from the burned photographs, still hear the clerk's voice repeating my name. The ache of loss remained sharp and raw, but beneath it ran something deeper. Resolve. The past had left scars, but it no longer owned me. I heard pieces of their unraveling not from gossip I chased, but from fragments that reached me whether I wanted them or not. A neighbor in Princeton mentioned Michael had sold the Mercedes he used to flaunt trading leather and chrome for an old sedan with squealing brakes. Another friend from Sophie's circle told Anna that Sophie's company let her go after clients whispered about her name being dragged through tabloids. The same people who toasted her at parties now crossed the street to avoid her. The child support order hit Michael like an anchor. 20% of his income carved away each month, and without Sophie's salary, the numbers no longer stretched. They moved out of the townhouse they once bragged about relocating to a cramped walk-up in Trenton, where the walls carried the scent of old cooking oil, and neighbors argued through paper-thin plaster. Gone were the marble countertops and private parking. Now Michael lugged groceries up 3 flights of stairs, while Sophie clutched her growing belly, her face pale from the weight of disappointment. Family gatherings shifted too. Relatives who once embraced their union now kept their distance, uncomfortable with the scandal attached to their names. My parents still supported them, but even their patience cracked when bills mounted and calls for help became constant. My father sent checks grudgingly. My mother pressed pearls into Sophie's palm, as if jewelry could soothe disgrace. But the warmth was gone, replaced by obligation. I imagined Sophie sitting in that dim apartment, scrolling through photos of the life she believed she had won, her manicured nails chipped, now her clothes stretched and tired. I imagined Michael counting dollars, the same man who once laughed at my modest salary, now staring at overdue notices with dread. News trickled to me that Sophie's baby shower had been a shadow of what she once boasted it would be. Only a handful of guests showed, and even they brought modest gifts, onesies and bottles, instead of the luxury strollers she had once bragged about. She had dreamed of raising her child in my apartment, overlooking the Hudson. Instead, she folded tiny clothes beside a radiator that hissed and clanged in the night. The irony was not lost on me. She had thought taking Michael would elevate her, thought carrying his child would crown her. Instead, both of them had been dragged down their choices, exposed, their reputations frayed. I did not gloat out loud. I did not need to. Their collapse played out like a lesson written across their own walls. Friends vanished. Money evaporated. The applause that once followed them had turned into silence. Michael tried to pick up extra contracts, but his reputation in the industry faltered. Clients were wary of hiring a man whose name appeared in scandal sheets. Sophie applied for smaller jobs, far beneath the position she once held, but doors closed quietly before her. Employers wanted no part of her drama. Each month, my lawyer sent me confirmation of the child support transfer. Cold, precise figures appearing in my account, not as wealth I needed, but as proof of consequence. Sometimes late at night, I thought of the baby, innocent, about to enter a world of chaos its parents had created. My heart tightened, but then I reminded myself I had not built that world for the child. They had. I never saw Michael or Sophie in person after the trial, but once walking through a grocery store downtown, I caught sight of them from across the aisle. Michael pushed a cart with dented wheels. Sophie waddled beside him, her face drawn, her voice sharp as she scolded him over prices. He looked older, beaten down, his posture bent under invisible weight. She looked tired, no shine left in her eyes. They did not see me. I turned away before they could. My pulse steadied, not from fear, but from recognition. This was the cost of betrayal. By the time spring edged into summer, I heard they had sold more furniture, downsized again, and stopped attending family events altogether. My parents still spoke their names, but quieter now, as if the shame had finally settled, too heavy, even for them. Justice had been handed down in the courtroom, but life had its own way of compounding the sentence. And for once, I did not feel crushed beneath the weight of family betrayal. I stood apart, watching the cracks spread in the house they had built on lies, knowing I no longer carried their burden. The world around me kept moving, but in the small, chaotic apartment across the river, Michael and Sophie were learning what it meant to pay in full. The weeks that followed pulled me back into the rhythm of work, but this time the rhythm felt different. I was assigned to lead a campaign for a major national brand, the kind of project that could shift the trajectory of my career. The conference room filled with energy as my team and I sketched concepts across whiteboards, the hum of ambition blending with laughter I hadn't heard from myself in a long while. David Harris called me into his office one afternoon. He leaned back in his chair, his tie loosened, a rare smile softening his sharp features. "Olivia, I have to say you've come back stronger than ever. This pitch is brilliant." He tapped the folder in front of him. "They love your vision. You've proven that resilience isn't just a word people throw around." The praise settled deep inside me, not as vanity, but as validation. I nodded, steady but grateful. "Thank you. I'm ready for this." The day we presented the final pitch, the office buzzed with anticipation. I stood at the head of the long oak table, lights dimmed, slides casting colors across the walls. Words flowed from me with a confidence I had not felt in years. The clients leaned forward, nodding, jotting notes, their eyes alive with interest. When I finished, the silence before their applause felt like the breath before a wave crests. Then they clapped firm and unanimous. The deal was ours. As the meeting broke, laughter and congratulations circled the room. I felt Anna's proud gaze from where she stood near the door. For a fleeting moment, I thought nothing could fracture that triumph. But then the door swung open. Michael walked in. The sound of his shoes against the tile froze the room. Conversations cut short, papers stilled in midair. He looked thinner, his suit rumpled, his eyes ringed with sleepless nights. Before I could react, he crossed the room, dropped to his knees in front of me, and his voice cracked loud enough for everyone to hear. "Olivia, please, forgive me." Gasps rippled through the room. My coworkers stared, some with shock, others with morbid curiosity. David Harris stood from his chair, his face tight with disapproval. Michael's eyes glistened as he reached toward me, but I stepped back, the distance sharp as glass. The man who once sat smug beside my sister now knelt in front of me, undone, desperate. "You destroyed our marriage," I said, my voice steady. "You stood silent while Sophie announced what you had done, and you let me burn for it. And now you come here in my place of work begging?" His lips trembled. "I made mistakes. I lost everything. You're the only one who can save me." The room held its breath. I felt every gaze pressing against me, waiting to see if I would break. But I did not. I shook my head slowly, letting the words cut clean. "No, Michael. I am not your savior. You chose your path, and I will never carry your burden again." His face collapsed, his shoulders sagging, as if the words themselves had weight. A security guard appeared at the door, David nodding once to send him forward. They lifted Michael, gently guiding him out. He did not resist. Silence lingered after he was gone. Then David looked at me, his eyes steady with something like respect. "You handled that with more dignity than most people could." I exhaled, the tension leaving me. Around the table, my colleagues began to clap. At first hesitant, then louder, rising until the room filled with it. Not for the scandal, not for the collapse of a man, but for the choice to stand firm. Later that evening, Anna met me at St. Mark's, the little church where she volunteered. Pastor John sat with us in the quiet sanctuary, the pews empty, the stained glass catching the fading light. His voice was gentle as he spoke. "Forgiveness is not always about the one who hurt you. Sometimes it is the gift you give yourself, so you no longer carry their chains." I stared at the flickering candles on the altar. My heart clenched at the thought of forgiving Michael or Sophie. But then I felt something shift. Forgiveness did not mean forgetting nor excusing. It meant loosening the grip of anger that had lived inside me. Anna placed her hand on mine. "You've already proven you can rise without them. Forgiveness is the last step. Not for him, but for you." I nodded slowly. For the first time, the word did not feel impossible. When I left the church, the city night stretched wide before me. My name was mine again. My work was thriving. The ghosts of betrayal had lost their hold. I walked into the cool air with my shoulders straight, no longer weighed down, but moving forward fully and entirely my own. 2 months later, the apartment no longer looked like the place I had once shared with Michael. The walls had been painted a soft ivory, the heavy curtains replaced with sheer ones that let the winter light flood through. The wedding photographs were gone. The frames dismantled the hollow spaces they once occupied, now filled with art I had chosen on my own. A vase of fresh tulips stood on the counter, their petals lifting toward the sky, as if refusing to bow. I walked barefoot across the hardwood floors, the boards warm from the heat that hissed through the vents. The air smelled faintly of new paint and candle wax. Each detail felt like a declaration that the past no longer owned a corner here. I ran my fingers over the spines of new books lining the shelf, novels I had wanted to read, but once felt guilty buying because he never thought they mattered. From the window, the skyline stretched wide and glittering. The Empire State Building shone in the distance, its spire cutting through the clouds. Below, the Hudson moved steady and dark, the same river that had swallowed my ring. I remembered the tremor in my hand that day, the way the diamond caught the light one last time before vanishing. That memory no longer made my chest tighten. It made me breathe easier. The kitchen counters gleamed free of the matching mugs and dinnerware that had once belonged to someone else's idea of home. I had donated them, replacing them with mismatched pieces collected from flea markets and small shops. Each plate carried its own story, imperfect but chosen. On the desk lay my notebook pages filled with entries I had written in long nights. Some were jagged sentences etched in anger. Others were soft, hesitant searching for meaning. I turned the pages slowly, the ink smudged in places where tears had fallen. It was a map of survival proof that I had lived through what once seemed impossible. I opened the balcony door and stepped into the cold. The city roared below, taxis weaving through traffic horns echoing off the buildings. I lifted my face to the sky where a pale sun pushed through the clouds. The air bit at my skin, but it also woke me clear and bracing. For weeks I had worked, written, breathed, and rebuilt. I had faced Michael's collapse, Sophie's unraveling my parents' betrayal. I had stood in court, in the office, in the sanctuary of a church pew, and I had not broken. Now in this moment, surrounded by the life I had remade, I felt something I hadn't dared to claim before. Peace. I whispered into the open air, my breath curling in the cold. I erase it all. And I begin again with myself. The words hung there, small but steady, carried away by the wind over New York. Inside, the tulips stood bright against the window. The walls no longer carried ghosts. The apartment was mine, and so was the life waiting ahead.